about opening the presence of loss and death. So thanks so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Brad, even though it says Darcy. We're using Darcy's computer here.
Hi. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So we're ready to go? Okay. So almost 20 years ago, Darcy and I first met shortly after the death of my youngest brother. And we met at a bereavement conference. And for a long time, our being together as a couple in any kind of permanent way seemed like an impossibility. When it did finally appear that our commitment to each other was very real and lasting, one of the first things I said to Darcy was, the only certainty is that one day I will leave you or you will leave me. The who, the why, the when is uncertain, but the leaving is inevitable. I'm just such a romantic. Since we both lived professional and private lives steeped in the realities of death, dying, and bereavement, my statement didn't seem to come as a shock or act as a deterrent. I was really only paraphrasing the Buddha, that every meeting entails a parting, and that, quote, what is near and dear will one day be otherwise. In the summer of 2019, I designed a self-guided meditation around one of the shortest suttas in the Pali Canon, the Nibbana Sutta or Nirvana Sutra. I added it into my practice and probably did some version of it at least once a week. And we might even work with some of this next weekend. The sutta simply goes, there is an unborn, uncreated, unconditioned, unformed. Were it not for the unborn, uncreated, unconditioned, unformed, there would be no escape from the world of the born, the created, the conditioned, and the formed. In May of 2020, right at the beginning of COVID lockdowns, I was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer. Darcy was not allowed to be in the hospital at the same time, but managed to attend the meeting online. I don't recall Darcy's exact questions, but it had to do with lifespan expectations. The only thing I remember is the doctors saying, well, we're likely looking at 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 7, maybe as much as 10. So even once I had begun treatment, there was no way of telling for at least 3 months whether or not the treatments would be effective. In the meantime, there was and still is the dealing with side effects, which are significant, unpredictable, and ongoing. People often ask, how are you doing? And my standard response has become, every day is an adventure. Just a word on this graphic that's up here. This is a gift that I sent to a friend who's a teacher who did a Dharma talk under the title of, What is this? Back to the first announcement in hospital. I actually found it intriguing to observe my own responses. As I waited in the entranceway of the hospital for the pharmacy to complete the prescription for my initial medication, I did have a feeling of overwhelm, but it was the overwhelm of gratitude, compassion, and peace. I found this very curious, especially since I've lived so much of my life in fear and shame. If I caught the mind going into papancha, that is the mind's unceasing habitual outflows about horrible scenarios and possibilities, then I would bring it back to the present. In the present, I could find no fear whatsoever. Grief, to be sure, but not fear. I found myself in awe that this stuff actually works, this practice, this teaching. The Buddha wasn't lying. This practice leads in but one direction, the unshakable deliverance of the heart. So here I am now, almost 2 years in And where things go from here is all still as mysterious. It all depends. Every 3 months, we wait the results of tests to see how things stand. So lest you think that this upcoming workshop might be purely academic and objective journey of abstract views and concepts, Darcy and I both literally have skin in the game. Our workshop will invite us to explore an in-depth investigation of the mysteries and the gifts of grief and loss, impermanence, suffering and not self, and the promise of the unshakable deliverance of the heart. A couple of notes regarding translations. The word dukkha, which is usually translated as suffering, many years ago, I said to one of my first Zen teachers, probably 35, 40 years ago, I said, really, the word dukkha should be translated, grief would be a closer translation. And I remember the teacher just kind of nodding in Dokusan and affirm or deny. And then many years later, when I was shifting from my Zen practice into more Theravadan-based practice, I was listening to a talk by Ajahn Sumedho and heard him say, grief is actually a more inclusive term for the word dukkha. Nirvana is another big one. Nirvana or nibbana in Pali, which so often gets translated as extinction, but the meanings that we take from that word are so far from the Buddha's intent. The only thing that becomes extinct is craving, ignorance, and aversion. The fires that drive samsara are extinguished, the fires that turn the wheel of suffering. The Buddha had about 40 some odd terms and phrases for nirvana, and extinguish only appears a couple of times and always in the above mentioned context. But he has other terms, the safety, the island beyond which you cannot go, the harbor, the unchanging, the unbinding, the release. Such positive expressions of nirvana or nibbana are far more numerous in the canon. And we will be examining the nuances much more next weekend. We can't do any work around grief or death in a Buddhist context without confronting a few key issues. Two of them are self and not self, and attachment, non-attachment. Let's take attachment, non-attachment first. I personally don't see a big discrepancy between healthy attachment in the psychological sense and non-attachment in the Buddhist sense. I simply find the choice of words unfortunate. The word attachment to me has always had a sense of stickiness to it, a kind of clinging. And of course, clinging attachment is seen as a primary source of suffering in Buddhism. I would prefer the word connection, but attachment theory has been so fundamental to grief theory that that phrase won't be going away ever, not anytime soon. And non-attachment in Buddhism certainly doesn't mean indifference or non-connection. And again, this is something we'll explore more in depth in the workshop. As for self, it often appears that self is taken as a given with not a lot of regard for its origins and development over time. One of the first workshops I facilitated was entitled The Grief Before Grief. My main point was that the basic human condition can be seen as one of bereavement, loss upon loss, culminating in death. My evolving thesis over time has been that the ego, the conditioned sense of self itself, coalesces and matures around a core of unresolved pain and fear. Here are two very important observations about childhood from widely different points of view. The first is from Donald Winnicott, a pediatrician and child psychoanalyst, and one of the first influential figures in developmental psychology. Winnicott says, in the early stages of emotional development, before the senses have been organized, before there is something that could be called an autonomous ego, very severe anxieties are experienced. In fact, the word anxiety is of no use. The order of infant distress at this stage being of the same order as that which lies behind panic. And panic is already a defense against the agony that makes people commit suicide rather than remember. Winnicott is clearly describing a scene of trauma here. And note that he's not talking about infants in abusive homes or subjects of violence and deprivation. He is saying that such experiences, which he calls primitive agonies, are universal and are bound to occur to any infant, regardless of loving, attentive parenting. You only need to observe closely an infant with an earache or a fever or hunger pains or other unexplained pains to witness this sensitive being writhing in vain attempts at fight or flight, trying to get out of their own skins. A psychologist who specializes in trauma, Harvey Schwartz, says, in trauma, the mind flees its own subjectivity in order to evacuate its pain. So as the mind dissociates from its own full subjectivity, what happens in the body? Well, if fight and flight aren't options, the only option is freeze. The body memories get frozen in the tissues, muscles, and nervous system, even if they are below the threshold of ego consciousness and language. In trauma speak, there is often reference to trauma capsules or layers of trauma. And this is precisely what can begin to emerge as meditation deepens and unfolds. And here is Ernest Becker, author of The Denial of Death, which became the basis for something called terror management theory. Becker is speaking about the dawning of consciousness and death, consciousness of death in the child. What we call the child's character is a modus vivendi achieved after the most unequal struggle any animal has to go through, a struggle that the child can never really understand because she doesn't know what is happening to her, why she is responding as she does, or what is really at stake in the battle. To grow up at all is to conceal the mass of internal scar tissue that throbs in our dreams. And not only her impotence to avoid death, but her impotence to stand alone, firmly rooted in her own powers, in the face of the terror of the world, the miracle of creation, the crushing power of reality. Not even the tiger has secure and limitless power, much less the child. So one of the first things a child has to do is to learn how to abandon ecstasy, to do without awe, to leave fear and trembling behind. Only then can she act with a certain oblivious self-confidence when she has naturalized her world. And we say naturalized, but we mean unnaturalized, falsified, with the truth obscured, the despair of the human condition hidden, a despair that the child glimpses in her night terrors and daytime phobias and neuroses. Added to this existential dilemma of primitive agonies and death anxiety is the fact that most of us live in cultures and societies that don't really support the inherent value of being human or even simply being. Despite this gloomy and scary picture, our workshop title suggests the opening of gifts. So how is this possible? The Buddha said that of all the footprints, that of the elephant is supreme. Of all the meditations, meditation on death is supreme. And elsewhere he says, this is in the Maranasati Sutta, mindfulness of death, if cultivated and frequently practiced, brings great fruit, great benefit. It merges in the deathless, ends in the deathless. Therefore, you should cultivate mindfulness of death. We're also going to explore and affirm the inherent value of our being prior to all becomings. Accompanying these kinds of self-compassion practices will be the appreciation, the recognition, and the cultivation of joy. This might seem counterintuitive in a workshop on grief and loss, but joy holds a key position in Buddhist practice. It is one of the factors of enlightenment. It's a key factor in jhana or samadhi qualities. It is also the third of the Brahma Viharas, mudita, and a sister of kindness, compassion, and equanimity. As we probe the three perceptions of existence, also known as the three marks of existence, anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, unreliability, not self, what can become increasingly clear is that there is something reliable, satisfactory, ever present, a space of refuge that one can call home. It is said in the Pali Canon that even the Buddha and fully enlightened arahants continue to practice mindfulness immersed in the body. Please note those words. This is not the same as mindfulness of the body or mindfulness of breathing. As various monks, teachers have pointed out, people can and do sit for a number of decades with the sense of observer somewhere at the back of the skull, behind the eyes, objectively watching the breath in the body. Perhaps they gained some calm and control over explosive emotions, but we have to get deeper and more intimate than that to gain any real and lasting insight and release. The way it is put in the Satipatthana, this so-called first foundation of mindfulness or first frame of reference, it's stated mindfulness of the body, as the body, in the body. It is only through this level of intimacy that we can gain some insight into other mysteries, such as, quote, those who taste mindfulness in the body taste the deathless. And within this fathom-high body lies the cosmos, the arising of the cosmos, the passing of the cosmos, and the way that leads to the cessation of arising and passing. And finally, one of the few things that the Buddha said about nirvana, there is consciousness without surface, luminous all round. So we patiently soften and open the armor and scales of conditioned fears and views that are frozen around the heart mind, the citta, as we face and journey into our grief and anxieties with discernment, wisdom, and with large doses of self-compassion. The promise of the Dharma is a place beyond grief and even beyond death, an island of safety beyond which you cannot go. And I'll now turn it over to Darcy, and hopefully you can sit, if you have any questions or comments, you could save them for the end when Darcy is finished. We're also going to trade seats. So you want to take this away?
Thank you. It's the practice of musical chairs. So I present a little bit differently. Brad and I very much complement each other in many ways. And so you'll see kind of how we do the complementary work with each other, certainly quite different, but yet very much aligned, which has been kind of our story from the beginning. So it's interesting to hear Brad describe the day that we met, shortly followed by the day when he was diagnosed with metastatic cancer. I think when we met, it was just the two of us in our own different ways of working around death and grief just came together in a way that fit. I felt like I was coming home when we met. It was a real gift. Brad had worked for years in cemeteries and crematoria. He regularly worked with people who had experienced loss and grief and trauma. I had worked as an advanced practice nurse, mostly in oncology and hospice care. And I completed graduate training in counseling psychology. I'd set up a clinical practice, working with people who were grieving, people who had experienced loss and trauma. And both of us had learned from our firsthand experiences from the people that were in our care. I'd been at the bedside of hundreds of people when they were dying and they took their last breath, and Brad had cared for the bodies of those who had departed. But as he mentioned, the day that he was diagnosed with cancer in 2020, I wasn't able to join him at the appointment. So we'll say my, what I call spidey senses were all up because I knew something was wrong. As a nurse who worked in the field, I suspected a diagnosis of cancer. What I did not expect was a diagnosis of metastatic cancer. And in a way, I was kind of grateful to be on the video link and not right there. I was glad to hear what the doctor was saying, to hear firsthand what was being shared, to go through all the tests and the studies, so I had an understanding. When Brad went to the pharmacy to fill his prescription, I ran to the bathroom because I had a violent eruption of protest from my gut. And while waiting for him to come home from the appointment, I remember sitting there and just thinking, wow, taking this all in. And I looked outside my window and this is what greeted me. It was almost like in the midst of my own angst and trying to wrap my head around what was happening, there was peace and beauty to just be found by looking up. And there he was. By the time Brad got home, we'd both settled kind of with the news. I recall we held each other saying that everything had changed and yet nothing had changed. I also remember thinking that, this is when you get to know if your practice is real. There was no expectation from either of us about how each of us would be with the news. We sat together without words for a long time. It's felt like our journeying through this territory of his treatment's been like an exclamation point at the end of a long sentence of other painful and challenging situations going on all around us. I think of the pandemic, the political divides with all the things that we see in the angst that's in the world, and the almost daily reports of some new climate disaster that adds to our feelings of helplessness and powerlessness. It's been a lot. And it's also a lot of grief over the many things that I once counted on. Early on, Brad and I had adopted this phrase that we called the practice of the beloved, letting our relationship be a conscious extension of our intention for compassion. These other issues, well, they've become a lot more complicated, and it's interesting to see how they have kind of filtered into the mix of exploring issues around loss and grief. My intention and motivation to demonstrate compassion in these situations probably has not been so straightforward. It's been a lot of work to come to a place of where do I sit with this stuff. So being the academic, I have to put up at least one academic slide because I talk a lot about our assumptive world, and this is formed when we're very, very young, and it's really how we get through the world and how we expect the world to be and how we feel safe. And then we bump up against all these events that happen that affect things like our relationships or our health or independence or our feeling of being secure or financial security. And these things bump into our assumptive world. And every time they bump, and if we can't absorb those things, our assumptive world kind of crumbles. And that's what leads to grief, is this crumbled assumptive world. And there's an awful lot of imagery here to take in from a Buddhist perspective. So the pandemic, okay, really at the core of the pandemic, it's just shown how little control we have over things that are near and dear to our hearts. That's something all of us have known, something all of us have been aware of, but now it's almost like the rubber hits the road and we just see how real this concept really is. Many of us have lost people that we love and value deeply. All of us have lost our lives as we once lived them and once knew them. On top of that, we have so many different perspectives about how to appropriately respond to this kind of sometimes pesky, but sometimes deadly virus. How do I demonstrate compassion for those whose ways of dealing with restrictions and vaccination radically are different from mine? It's easy to go into a very self-righteous place of clarity. I can get very clear very quickly and very rigidly as well. I don't think that's especially aligned with my intention to practice compassion. And I put up this slide, not because I want to make a joke, but because I see the pain that's underneath all of this. I see the pain of the isolation. I see the pain of separation. I see the pain of division and so many layers by this cartoon. And it just hit me when I first saw it, that I really felt I'd put it up there as an example of what I want to talk about here. This is where the political sphere reminds us of how little control we have. It reminds us of so many things that are near and dear to us and to our assumptive world. See, I'm originally from the United States. I live in Canada, and I have lived in Canada now for a very long time. But when I lived in the States, my recall of elections was that I was disappointed if the person that you voted for didn't get elected. Everyone would sigh, and then life would go on. Not so now. So elections are battlegrounds. Everyone goes to the polls. The research looks and talks about the divisions. One of the research studies I read, it was by the Pew Research Center, talked about interviewing people from various sides of the reference, both Republicans and Democrats. And each side came just short of saying that one side wishes the others who don't agree with them would just be better off dead. And, this is a form of social death that we're talking about. So people on Facebook and social media delete those who don't share their views. And families have been torn apart with people losing loved ones, not by death, but by deletion. So these experiences are such deeply personal losses that originate in the socio-political context. I heard one person recently state that they had expected their father to die when they got older, but instead he's dead to them because he watches Fox News. There's so much grief there, and it's a different kind of death that we don't talk about, but it is death nonetheless. And once again, how do we navigate this territory with integrity and compassion for ourselves and for those around us? This form of death creates so much angst and anxiety for so many. And if my desire is to enact compassion, the intention to address that suffering and to relieve it in whatever ways possible, how am I an agent of compassion when things that are so deep and dear to me, these rigid beliefs that I have, are so deeply challenged as well? And then, of course, climate change. Most of us watched in horror this past summer as we saw the scorching heat and the rampant wildfires that affected the West last summer. This was in Canada and the United States and in many places around the world. I think of how many times a day I'm regularly bombarded with reports of retreating glaciers, intensification of weather patterns, and the loss of habitat for important and beloved species on our planet. Once again, feelings of anger, helplessness, and overwhelm often accompany our exposure to these realities. Some people talk about the death of the planet. I think it's the death of our dreams. It's the death of our hopes. It's the death of things that we consider to be sacred to us and the world and the earth. So I think a lot of us are kind of feeling this way right now. I love this picture. The Buddha is still there amidst all the rubble, and we sit with that. That's what keeps us sitting and keeps us steady. And I think to myself, so there's death. There's death, which Brad discussed, pertaining to the cessation of our life here as physical beings. There's also non-death loss and death and the grief that follows them, such as the death of our hopes and our dreams, our relationships, and our life as we've known it. And underneath it all is this fear of losing what we love and are clinging to a need for certainty, which is the very essence of what we've learned about and sat with for as long as we've practiced. And this has been the primary focus of my academic research and writing. And I plan to share some of this work when we meet for the workshop later this week as well. So if you go back to my image of the pane of glass that was broken, I always think of that as a loss, that when you see that pane of glass that's broken, I'll go back real quick to that slide because I think it's really poignant. This is how I define a loss. A loss is when the glass is shattered. You could try putting this back together again with glue. You might be able to do it. It'll never look the same. And to me, that's where we hit against a loss. That loss happens when we know something has happened. We can't go back. We can't resume the way things were the same. We can't unknow now what we know. So what do we do with that? And this is where I came up with this picture of the stained glass, because beautiful stained glass is made from shards of broken glass. That it's not that we could create order, or the goal is to create something beautiful. The idea is that we can come together in ways that make it meaningful again. We can actually take these pieces of broken glass and put them together in a way that does establish a sense of meaning for us, even though we know where they came from was a group of shards of glass that were on the floor. So in our time together in the workshop this week, I think Brad and I hope to share some of our thoughts, do some practices around learnings about death and loss. And we plan to combine periods of practice with explorations and discussions about teaching of the Buddha, as well as a bit of theory about how we understand death and non-death loss and grief. We're really pleased and honored to be invited to come share with you this week. We really look forward to this time with each of you. So I think what I'll do is I'll stop share, and maybe Brad and I will just try to come together and share the space a little bit and see if you have any comments or thoughts that we can share into a discussion together. Here I go. Okay, I see things in the chat, and I'm not sure, are we monitoring chat or?
That might be.
All right. So this is from the membership. Okay. All right. So hello, everybody. Let me go back to the gallery view so we can see everyone. What are your thoughts?
Hi, this is Anne. I have a kind of a question, and that's around some of the stuff that's going on. So kind of the practical things that Darcy was talking about. And part of this is having served as a chaplain in the hospital during the second wave. And that's just pure raw anger that people have. And it's not necessarily anger that's going to cause divisiveness, but it is anger. And I think righteous anger because both the size of the second wave and now the current wave that's maybe subsiding, as well as climate change, they're caused by people. And how do you, I see you shaking your head like yes, but where do you put that? You know, where do you put that anger that doesn't necessarily lead to divisiveness, but it's there?
Do you mean your anger or the anger that's directed towards you?
No, well, partly say the anger of an ICU nurse.
Yeah.
Or even my anger as I'm making rounds, and
Sure.
I know that some of the suffering is caused by people,
Right.
and or being in a room with a person who's quite sick, and then you figure out they're not vaccinated, but you serve them anyway. But when you leave, there's a grr going on. And even with climate change, it's not like I'm throwing the anger at people, but there is an anger that comes. I think it's a natural thing, but what do you do with it?
So there's, I don't know if it's like actually a whole separate workshop on something called moral outrage. And and I think we all feel it at times, and people on any side of the divide feel moral outrage. They always feel that the other side is evil or lesser than, or and so the question is, can we do something creative with moral outrage without it turning into rage? Now, I'm trying to think of what's her name? Who's got the
Cinda Rushton.
Yeah, Cinda Rushton writes a lot about principled moral outrage. So take and Darcy and I did. Well, I did the chaplaincy training at UPIA, but on top of that, we did a week of death and dying training with Joan Halifax. And one of the things that came up was a lot of nurses being in a position of being overruled and ordered to do things on a daily basis that they know is causing nothing but suffering to the patients. And what does that do to you? How, so that many of the things that get called compassion fatigue aren't actually compassion fatigue. It's that something else, either in the system or a skill we haven't quite mastered yet, is out of whack. So, and it's not easy. I mean, to maintain equanimity without it turning into indifference, right?
Mm-hmm.
In what I was reading, one of, I think, Joan's most recent book, and she talks about a therapist who, after years of doing therapy, he suddenly realized he hated all of his clients. He detested doing therapy because he was just fried. He'd gone past the point of moral outrage, and it was burning out his own empathy and compassion. Or he had gone to empathy overload, empathy overwhelm, and wasn't able to go into a place of compassion where he could act compassionately. He's just stuck there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's a challenge for anybody. And then on top of that, we have systems that are not helpful. You know, one thing I said in my talk, and we'll investigate, is that the systems that we live within do not affirm our own innate value. It's all based on, what can you do for me?
Mm-hmm.
How can you produce? And that even gets into the spiritual community. And we take that into our practice. You know, I got to get this, I got to get that. Next koan, what's the next koan? The next, you know, and I got to get this, you know. And so there's all of this conditioned pressure, and we've turned away from our own innate value. And even our education system is in many ways the worst for that. It's all about, you've got to get this and this and this and this, and then you get there. But as far as, you know, where is the addressing of emotional intelligence? Where is the addressing of compassion and how to be in relationship with other people? There's not much about any of that in any school curriculum, right? So, and then we've got other systems that are like that. There's the phrase horizontal and vertical hostility. The number of institutions where, you know, there's huge staff turnover, and they say, oh, that person left because they just have compassion fatigue. But in fact, the policies, either the up-down policies of the institution were just untenable and tearing their heart apart, or sometimes there's horizontal hostilities on the same floor, in the same unit. You know, people are people, and they define you as something, and then they decide, well, I'm going to make your life miserable. You know, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. So here you are trying to do this already very difficult work of working in a compassionate way with people who are suffering, and you're getting, you know, literally stabbed in the back by your coworkers who are supposed to be committed to the same principles, right? And how did they get like that? what is it that happened in their work? So anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
It's
Darcy's
okay.
got
No,
lots of.
this is a one I struggle with quite a bit, actually. And
Yeah.
yeah. First thing I think too is that when the anger arises, we recognize, the anger is serving a purpose, right? And we're so busy thinking anger is such a bad thing, but the anger is really telling us something important. It's a protective emotion. So when I'm angry at these people who I think should have done something they didn't do, and now we're all paying the price, I recognize that anger is coming up for a reason. So I kind of bow to the anger and say thank you for making me aware of something I need to know about myself. And then I often go to actually the Tao symbol, the yin yang symbol, when I'm looking at how do I want to respond, because I want the response to be, as Senda Rushton talks about, a principled response, true to my intention, that I don't want to then, in my desire to relieve suffering, start adding suffering to the world of my own. And so sometimes I think it's not a one size fits all. Each one of us decides, do I listen and bear witness and sit with this? I'm in a way actively listening and involved and engaged in that way, or am I more actively engaged in terms of, for me, education is a big one, because I have that as a venue, or writing, because that's an outlet I do have. Brad has his groups that he does his meditation work, and they have discussions around it. Each of us, I think, has our own way, our own outlet for choosing how we demonstrate compassion. I'm just careful because while I think that political action is really important, and I think the important part is principled action that comes from a place of deep intention, comes from a place of knowing why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's a response and not reactivity. That I think this is where you look at the leaders that we've admired who have become known for their engaged Buddhist practice, have become known for their ability to call truth to power, to speak truth to oppression and power and stupidity. I don't know what else to describe it. And we think about how they've done it. They've done it with equanimity. They've done it with true intention, and that's really the best we can do. If we are acting out of intention, if we are acting out of a place of intentioned response, I think that's what we can do. We're human, but that's where I really hope that I'm not perfect. I don't hold myself to be perfect, but may I know how I need to be in a given moment, because I've sat with that moment. And the reactivity is what wears us out. The reactivity is what burns us out. It's not that I don't feel pain when I see people hurting, or an unnecessary death, or something that's happened that I feel is completely unfair. That goes back to this assumptive world that assumes life was fair, or that everybody acts in a rational way. So to go back to those places and to be very clear with my intention, with what the tools are available at my discretion and disposal, in order to be able to enact the compassion that I want to enact in the world. Does that help, Em? It's a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Very long answer and lots in there. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And without attachment to outcome, because if we're attached to a preconceived outcome, we're always going to be thrown, because even if it turns out good, it's a different good than we envisioned, right? And it doesn't always turn out good, right? Mm-hmm. So if we're attached to outcome, we're setting ourselves up for ongoing disappointment and frustration.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for, that I do conflict facilitation in the transformative model. And so I'm having to manage my incredible excitement to hear my people and get to what I would like. I find that and I'm wondering how you can see this. I think maintaining equanimity in these situations, in my experience, is maintaining an intimate relationship with vulnerability. which includes no outcome, which is so uncomfortable.
Mm.
The sensations that I identify it with are when I got a divorce. All of a sudden, my future wasn't the future that I thought it was going to be, like you all had in 2020. All of a sudden, there it is, impermanence with all caps. I want to say I loved what you said about clarity becoming rigid. I'm going to really play with that. That's, because then it's not clarity anymore, right? I work with healthcare providers, frontline workers, and they're like, yeah, Barb, what can you teach? I mean, we don't have time. And so one thing I'll say that they've done is identified thresholds where they can at least have a little bit of relief. And the threshold for two of the groups is when they push that hand sanitizer button going in and out of the room. They just connect with their heart and offer and just say, this is suffering, or, whatever they need to. And having thresholds, I think, can be very important. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the boots on the ground aspect of this, the parents with boots on the ground, the librarians now with boots on the ground, right? The whoever it is, the police officers, the transportation workers, the healthcare workers. And thank you again for your work and your intention.
I think it's a misconception that practice has to be about sitting zazen for an hour at a time. It can be a moment. And I think what you're talking about, pushing the button of the hand sanitizer. And in my own practice with clients, this is something, I have several clients that are in healthcare right now. And wow, it's just really hard. Brad and I attended what they call a GRACE training at Upaya Zen Center. It's a model of compassionate response. And you gather your attention, you recall your intention. You go through the GRACE model, but the E is you engage and then you end. And I've talked with some of my nurses, especially, that they have to wash their hands in between patients when they're working on the floors. That is their moment. That is I wash this here. I leave this here. I take with me what I need to, but I leave all of the reactions, all of the feelings that are going with this. I leave that and it goes with this water. And I go to the next situation. And certainly there are times when you do have to stop, and the stuff that did stay, you need to take a look at it, but you don't need to take it all on you. And I think you mentioned this beautiful ritual of just the hand sanitizer, the moment of awareness, the moment of, I'm here, the moment of my intention. It doesn't have to be time consuming. It becomes a habit. And that's a habit of remembering why I'm here, a habit of valuing what I'm doing, even if the outcome isn't what I'm hoping for, or what I see coming in the door feels overwhelming in this moment. I'm right here, and each moment is each moment.
The whole reminds me of somebody saying to Ajahn Chah, but I don't have time to meditate. And Ajahn Chah saying, do you have time to breathe? So that the moment of gathering ground doesn't have to be, okay, I can't deal with this situation until I do 30 minutes of Zazen. It's like, body is here in this moment. Here's the breath. This is what I'm experiencing. Can I drop down to my feet? Can I get into my hara? Can I get into my heart? Can I drop my preconceived notions? And then engage with whatever is happening. So it doesn't have to be a long, involved process, but that's why it's called a practice, right? I mean, if you only do it when things are difficult, it's going to be difficult to do. But if we're doing it all the time, it just becomes our natural response. So
Thank you.
I think we got about 5 minutes left. June?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Brad and Darcy. I appreciate your beautiful talk today. I think what you were just talking about, Brad, was mindfulness in the body, right? That's when you said a taste of mindfulness in the body is a taste of the deathless. So that's what you were talking about.
Yeah.
It's being and mindful of how does my body feel? How does my stomach?
Well, yeah, I mean, any of the guided meditations I do next weekend will try to point to that fact that it's all in the body. I mean, all 5 aggregates, all 5 skandhas, all 5 khandhas, whatever you call them, are experienced in the body. So if we're really embodied, that's where we know what's going on. That's where we know when the demons are coming up, right? When our old habits are coming up, because we feel it in the body first. That's when we know when a train of thought is headed to a disaster zone, because we start to feel the body getting, worked up and tense and constricted, tightness around the heart. What is that about? And you tune into what you're thinking, go, oh, no wonder. No wonder I'm feeling this, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's all an embodied practice. And the body is also where we clear it. Breathing in, breathing out, clearing, feeling the energy that's there and breathing right through it. Again, without attachment to outcome, without getting anxious about, I've got to do this now. I mean, it's taken us our whole lives to get wound up in knots. It's going to take us a while to undo those knots. And we got to be compassionate with ourselves in that work. So,
Thank you.
thanks for your question, June. Your comment. Yeah.
Thank you, Brad and Darcy. We're so fortunate to have you and to have you doing this workshop this next weekend. I hope many of you will avail yourselves of it. Really wonderful to have you here this morning. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Yeah. Being embodied. When I get worked up, I don't sleep well at night. It's as simple as that, if I get worked up, I don't sleep well. My body won't let go, So, yeah.
So I think it's pretty close to time, if unless anybody has anything else.
Just a huge thank you to you both. And I look
Oh.
forward to being with you this weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you.